So again, welcome everyone to our presentation this evening. It's a presentation of the Lost First Monday Grief Speaker Series. My name is Emily Tegenkamp, and I am a clinician here with the Lost program. I came on staff. It'll be 5 years in May that I've been with the program. And before that, I was a Lost member. So I know I've met many of you in groups or through conversations or even counseling. So some of you know my story and some of you don't, but I lost my older brother Joel to suicide in June of 2014. And so that experience certainly, informs a lot of the things that I talk about, and as well as the interactions that I have with all of you through my work here at Lost. So you might hear some things about my own personal story or some comments that I make. I hope that they'll resonate. And also I hope that there are some pieces of information in here that maybe help you think about things a little bit differently, or if there's something that you're worried about, maybe it'll give you some peace of mind that it isn't just you, that there's a lot of folks who are maybe asking the same questions or going through the same process. So I hope we have a good discussion this evening. So we'll go ahead and get started. All right. So just to kind of outline some things for us this evening, these are going to sort of be our main themes that we're touching on. So we're going to be talking about how does our relationship with the person who died impact our grief experiences? How does our loss impact our current interpersonal relationships? And how does grief from suicide loss impact our ability to form new relationships? So all of those things look a little bit different, although they certainly have themes that overlap, as we'll discuss. This is going to be a little bit of a mix of things. So although there's going to be a lot of examples, vignettes, anecdotes, I'll also have some research data, some qualitative data, and just kind of, talking through the things that research also tells us about personal experience, in the hopes that is helpful. One thing to keep in mind that, not everything we discuss tonight might resonate with you. It might not be familiar with your experience. Your experiences with relationships could look very different from this, and that's okay. We often say in the program, everyone's grief experience is very valid. It's just also very different. So, something to keep in mind. And although we're not going to talk about this explicitly tonight, one thing that I think sort of underlines all of this is our intrapersonal relationship, which is the relationship we have with ourselves. So what do we tell ourselves about ourselves? And how does that influence our ability to work through our grief? So those are just some of the things that we are going to touch on. But first, my slide will move. There we go. We're going to talk about relationships in general, and just start with a couple quotes that I think are just kind of speak to set the theme a little bit here. So no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. So many of you have probably heard that quote before. It's also used in some of this interpersonal relationship literature, which I thought was interesting. And this other quote by Goethe says, "The world is so empty if one thinks only of mountains, rivers, and cities, but to know someone who thinks and feels with us, and who, though distant, is close to us in spirit, this makes the earth for us an inhabited garden." So talking about, just the beautiful pieces that come from relationships, even if we're talking about some of the challenges of that tonight also. All right, so it went the wrong way. There we go. Okay, so why are we discussing relationships and why is this important? And I think that this is just something that's important for us to touch on, even though I think it's something that we maybe already know. And so I think it's important for us to talk about the biological and social benefits for humans to be in relationships. So we have a biological pull to be in relationship with others, which from an evolutionary sense really comes from a place of necessity. And so these are sort of the themes we'll discuss with this as we move from survival to belongingness and from necessity to seeking substantial, meaningful interactions. So in an evolutionary sense, when we started to form family groups and we started to form tribes, these are really, a way for us to share resources, to maximize survival between people, making sure that people had what they needed in terms of their basic needs to survive. And over time, what that looks like for us has become very different. It's now taken on, relationships now have taken on a more of a social meaning for us. Although we still, of course, rely on people to meet our basic needs. We know that there are people, doing all parts of the food chain to make sure that we're being fed. But it's looking a little different in terms of how our needs are met by others. And moving from a sense of survival to belongingness. So when we talk about belongingness tonight, and this is gonna sort of be a running theme through some of our conversation. Really, that is our huge benefit and purpose of having human relationships, is a sense of belongingness. And that sense of belongingness, and again, we'll unpack that a little bit more. But what we know is that belongingness is directly correlated with mental health outcomes. That a sense of belongingness is something that is a really essential psychological need for us to have. And that things can feel really disrupted when we don't feel that way, when we don't feel a sense of belongingness. And then belongingness has a bit of a different definition. So when we're talking about belongingness and sort of the sense that I mean it, these are interactions defined as with the same people that are frequent and positive over a course of time. Oops, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that. That are over a course of time. So when we talk about meaningful, substantial relationships, we're not talking about just little small interactions that we maybe have with other people, although that can lead to a belongingness in a greater societal sense or part of a community. That sense of substantial, meaningful interactions and belongingness is really going to come from more substantial and closer relationships. That emotional connectedness is something that we're really seeking. And I think one of the things that's really important is that we're not talking about the number of relationships. We're talking about the substance of those relationships. So we don't need to have 1 million friends to have a sense of belonging. We can have a couple people in our life who really see us, who really accept us in a non-judgmental way, and that can lead to a sense of belonging. So it's not about being popular. It's about being, cared for. So I think that that's just an important distinction. And the other thing I'll say about that too is that this also represents a range of the depth of relationships. So again, just like I said, that human interaction is not the same as belongingness. We also know that not all relationships give us a sense of belongingness. So there may be people that we're in relationship with who we're actually very close to, but those relationships aren't necessarily positive. And so if there's a relationship that represents abuse or neglect or dysfunction in some way, that may not give us the sense of belonging that we're seeking, despite the fact that that person represents a close relationship, which I know is a little complicated, but we'll unpack that a little bit too. Okay, so this leads us to one of the things that we'll be discussing here, which is the interpersonal theory of suicide. So I always like to stress that there are many theories around suicide and why people take their lives. There is no one theory that encompasses all of our experiences of everyone who's in the room here today, where I can give you a theory and each of us can nod our heads and say, yes, that fits. That's exactly what it was. That's exactly what happened. And so just know, if talking about the interpersonal theory of suicide is something that, resonates with you, okay, it resonates with me too. But that doesn't mean that there won't be folks who join us tonight whose experience is very different from that. But what the interpersonal theory of suicide says, it proposes that the combination of thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness can lead to suicidal behavior. So both of those things, thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness, which are sort of big phrases, but we'll unpack that a little bit and talk about what that means. So this was a theory that was proposed by Thomas Joyner, who's a really well-known suicidologist and researcher. And what it's talking about in terms of suicidal behavior, which I think is also important to talk about, is that it means ideations in terms of having suicidal thoughts, communications. So it could be, communicating those thoughts or communicating some level of psychological pain, as well as active behavior. So suicide attempts. And these are things that are showing a potential desire for suicide, but there's another piece of that, which means that it must be combined with an acquired capacity to enact on lethal self-injury, which is something that develops over time. So basically what the theory is saying is that somebody can feel a sense of thwarted belongingness, they can feel a sense of perceived burdensomeness, and that over time, when someone is having suicidal behavior, this can add up basically to an acquired capacity to enact lethal self-injury. So it's something that sort of builds on itself. This is not actually a new discussion, although the theory itself has been around, a couple decades now. But this idea of isolation, a lack of belongingness, and how that impacts our mental health has actually been around since the late 1800s as a potential theory as to why people engage in self-harm and suicidal behavior. And it also sort of goes hand in hand with some of the other theories around suicide that we have. So some of my clinicians in the room, for example, we sometimes talk about Schneidman, another well-known suicide researcher who talks a lot about unmet psychological needs or psychological pain, and how that accumulates to lead to suicide behavior in someone. And some of that same psychological pain that he discusses is coming from a place of security or seeking achievement, trust, friendships, strong interpersonal relationships, succorance, which is a need to nurture or to be nurtured by others. And so we know that these ideas of thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness can also amount to psychological pain that someone may be experiencing. So I know that one's a little complicated, but I think this next slide will give you a little bit of a better sense of what we're looking at. So, and I'm sorry if this is a little small. I tried to fit it all on one page, but this is the interpersonal needs questionnaire. So this is a tool that one might use if they were sort of using the lens of the interpersonal theory of suicide to try to gauge suicidal behavior or suicidal ideation in someone. And so these questions really are meant to sort of invoke this sense of, again, belongingness or perceived burdensomeness, and they're pretty direct in asking that. So these days, the people in my life would be happier without me. These days, I think I am a burden on society. These days, I think I make things worse for the people in my life. I feel disconnected from other people. I feel like an outsider in social gatherings. And so I think one thing that this can be useful for is for us to take a look perhaps at what was the experience of the person we lost in terms of their interpersonal relationships. So I know that this is something that, I've talked about in my family, that for, my brother, absolutely thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness were things that he dealt with. They were things that he had communicated to us. And so, for us, we can read these things and think, oh yeah, okay, that really fits. Some of you, may have very different experiences from this. It's not uncommon for us to hear folks come to group and say things like, my loved one was the life of the party. They were always so upbeat, and they had a million friends, and they were just so social, right? And so there are pieces of it that may that may not seem to fit. And so I think that the important part of that is that this is about perception, right? So our perception of how somebody maybe was making their way through social situations, or how they sort of related to their interactions with other people, what they saw themselves as a friend or as a parent, as a sibling, their perception of that might look very different than our perception of that. And so if they were, filling this out, there's a chance that they would answer it with things that we just don't know about their own personal experiences. And I think, we often talk about how postvention after suicide loss, which is what, bereavement support is here in the loss program, it really is meant to also be prevention. We know that people who experience a loss to suicide can really struggle with their own mental health. And so I think that it's something that we can sort of take a look at for ourselves too. Are we noticing changes in how we're viewing our interpersonal relationships? Are we feeling like we are somehow not fitting in or missing a sense of belonging in our groups or in our family now that we've experienced loss? Do we feel that our grief has become a burden to others? And so we are, now isolating and pulling away. So I think it's a lens that we can sort of view our own experiences from also. And I think just a way for us to conceptualize this a little bit when we sort of think about the reasons, how relationships play a role in people's mental health. So this is the interpersonal theory of suicide and the interpersonal needs questionnaire. Okay, so now we're going to kind of go into this this first theme that we had sort of outlined at the beginning, and we've already touched on this a little bit, but we're going to expand on it a little about how does our relationship with the person who died impact our grief experiences. Take a drink. So there are a lot of different things to explore in each of these categories, as I mentioned. So we're not going to touch on everything that we could touch on, but I hope that some of these will be familiar for some folks, or that you'll understand sort of where we're coming from. So this first point, who we lost and what that relationship represented to us will have an influence on how we grieve. After a suicide loss, it is not uncommon for survivors to examine and scrutinize the relationship they had with the person who died. We may also examine the role of relationships in the lives of the person we lost. So that last bullet point is a little what we were doing in that last slide. When we're looking at the interpersonal needs questionnaire, we're thinking about interpersonal relationships and how that could have played a role and the mental health of our loved one. That's sort of what we're looking at, is looking at the role of relationships with the person that we lost. What we're looking for with that first bullet point, who we lost, what the relationship represented to us will have an influence on how we grieve. We're looking at that in a couple different ways. So we're looking at that in terms of closeness and in terms of degree of relationship. So we'll expand on that a little bit too. But really the idea that I want to emphasize there is that our perceived closeness to someone and our degree of relationship might be very different. And so we're not just talking about how close someone is to us on a family tree. We're really talking about how close people are to us in terms of that sense of belonging, and in terms of those really close interpersonal relationships. So we'll talk more about that. And I think the second bullet point is definitely something that I want to highlight. It's very, very common for us to hear from survivors that they're really examining and scrutinizing the relationship they had with the person that they lost. This is where we get a lot of reports of people who are experiencing self-blame, who are really working through some experiences of guilt, or some feelings of responsibility, a sense of wrongdoing. Sort of those things that we're trying to think, are there things that I did or that I failed to do that somehow have now culminated in my loved one taking their life. And so this is a very, very common process for survivors to go through. Sometimes I call it, the investigative process of just trying to figure out sort of how we fit into the why question, right? So we often ask the why question of why someone dies by suicide. And this is sort of our process of finding out how we fit into that role, if we fit into that in some way, what role we played and the why. Sometimes we feel in these relationships, when we take a look at them, we can sometimes feel sort of duped. We can maybe feel abandoned. We can feel rejected. We can feel as though the relationship that we thought was so important and was so maybe healthy and positive. Now we're questioning that. Did I have that wrong? Was that not true? Did my loved one know how much I loved them? Did they know how much I cared about them? And just kind of, thinking through all of those, again, those things where we perceive perhaps we could have done something, perhaps I failed to do something. So just a lot of that, again, that scrutiny. And I think that this is also where we sort of look at the timeline of sort of how things kind of fall in line. And what I mean by that is really like if we're looking at perhaps the last few days of our loved one's life, for example, and we know that we had an argument, or we know that we said something that was unkind, or we know that we just, hadn't been getting along, or, something was off, right? All of those different places where we can really feel a lot of guilt and blame. And so I think these are just important things for us to have in mind. And then again, we'll start talking a little bit more about our own interpersonal relationships after this, but this one is more about the relationship with the person we lost. So this next one, I'm hoping we can all do a little participation, and I'm going to share a poll with everybody in a second. And so I'm hoping folks will be able to see it, even if you're joining from like a phone or a tablet. I think you will. But what I wanted to do is I kind of just wanted to gauge who is in the room with us tonight, who is joining us. And so you'll see that the way this question is asked, I want you to answer it in terms of your role, your relationship role. So if you lost a child, for example, you would answer it as I am a parent. If you lost a parent, you would say I am a child. So I think you'll kind of see. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll, and hopefully folks will see it. I hope you do. And then hopefully we can just get a little greater sense of who is here. And I'm realizing my clinicians, because I've got clinicians here. You can put other, that's okay. If you have a personal loss, feel free to put that in there too. And if not, we can look at the other. So I'm just going to let that go for a second and see if we have any themes sort of arise here. And kind of who is in the room with us. One of the things that I think is so special about the loss program is that we have an opportunity to work with people who represent all of these relationships. So we work with parents, we work with, children who have lost parents, we work with, a lot of people who have lost friends or siblings. And so I always just like to know who's in the room. So it looks like we do have a lot of others on here. So if we have a lot of others, maybe if you want to put in the chat, I can maybe take a look at that too and see if there are people on there. Oh my gosh, how did I forget spouse? Thank you so much. I must have left that out by accident. I apologize. I was only allowed so many options, so I really apologize for that. But yes, spouse is a big one. It's a really big one, and we have several spousal examples in here, I promise. So that is a big one. Okay. So yeah, so we definitely have several spouses, a lot of parents who are joining us today. So really folks in most of these categories. Yeah. Okay. So I'm really sorry about that I left off the spouse when I did it before. I know it was on there. So my apologies, but okay. So that gives you a better idea. So thank you so much. One of the reasons I wanted to ask is because we're going to go into a lot of examples and some of these different talking points that we'll go into. And it might just help to kind of guide that discussion a little bit. But I really tried to pull out examples and anecdotes that speak to a lot of different relationship experiences. So hopefully there will be something in there that will resonate with you. And I think the other reason that I really think that this question is important is that our relationships can also help to form our identity, right? So if I were to ask you to describe yourself, you might say, I'm tall, I'm smart, I, have short hair, whatever that looks like. But we often also define ourselves by the roles that we play. So we might define ourselves as a parent or as a sister, as an aunt, as a cousin, as a good friend. That those are also really just important parts of our identity. So thank you so much. It helps me a lot. So you guys can kind of all see that too. I don't know if you actually saw the poll results, but there they are. You can kind of see. Again, I'm sorry to my spouses, but I promise there are some examples in here. So we'll definitely talk about that because that is an important one. Okay. I can go. Okay, great. Here we go. So now I hope you can all see this sort of visual thing. It sort of looks like a target. And this is just gonna give us a way to conceptualize some of the things that we're gonna talk about now. When we're taking a look at our relationships, using a visual like this can really help us to conceptualize a couple of things. One thing that it can help with is talking about degree of relationships versus closeness of relationships, right? So that's what I meant when I said that people who are closest to you aren't always the people who are closest in your family tree. So if we were to build this out for ourselves, right, there are people whose parents might be in this circle. They're really close. They share things. They have really positive relationships. There are others who their parents may be out here. Those are not the people that I receive support from. They're not the people that I feel closest to, and that's okay. So I want to emphasize that and a lot of what we're going to be talking about, the degree of relationship is going to be less important than the closeness of the relationship in a lot of ways. One of the big examples of this is when we have friends who join us at our support groups, and they often will say, well, yes, I lost a friend, but they were family, right? They were my brother, they were my sister. And so we know that, those titles don't always tell the whole story of what somebody means to us, who they are to us, the role that they play in our lives. And so I just want to acknowledge that that's definitely something that we know. But when we're looking at this from a lens of belongingness, we're really concentrating on these inner circles, right? So like I mentioned before, it's great to have some acquaintances. It's great to have positive social interactions that are, short and sweet. Maybe when we're at a store, right? We want those to be positive, but those are not the relationships that are giving us a sense of belonging. They're not the relationships that are giving us a real sense of meaning for us. Those are the relationships that are here much closer to the core. And again, we get benefit from being parts of greater societies or our cultural identities, our racial identities, whatever that looks like. There are different parts of belongingness that come with that. But we're mostly just talking about how that works in interpersonal close relationships. So we'll get into that a little bit too. So now that we have the visual, we can sort of talk more about this. How does perceived closeness impact grief? And it absolutely does. So this first bullet point here is just something that I think it's just really profound. When I read statistics like this, sometimes I'm just really humbled by them. But what it says is nearly half of the US population will be familiar with someone who died by suicide throughout their lifetime. That is such an astounding amount of people. And that doesn't mean that we as a society, that half of the US population will be profoundly impacted or will experience the same level of trauma that many of us have who are here in the program. But what it means is, when we're going back to this visual of the circles, is that these ripples, right? The way that a loss ripples out, if we imagine this is our loved one, and maybe this is us in this close relationship, that loss has impacts for people in all of these different circles. Those ripples have an impact. Suicide exposure has an impact. What that looks like, and how we heal from that or we move forward from that will look very different. But it's just kind of a way to sort of show how that moves outward in that way. Because suicide exposure is something that clearly is going to impact all of us to some degree, or most of us to some degree. Our perception of closeness is often more impactful than the degree of relationships. So again, we talked about that, that it's not necessarily the title that someone has. It's not how close they are to in our family tree. It's what they mean to us, and it's how close we perceive we are. This third bullet point I know is a little confusing, but I'll explain that too. That one can have a high degree of impact around the loss and a low degree of closeness. So when we look at something like that, it might be perhaps somebody who witnesses a suicide of a stranger, right? In that case, that is highly, highly traumatic. It's a very traumatic event, but the degree of closeness is very low. This is someone that they didn't know. And so that's where we sort of see these things, where these things are not always aligned, that perhaps the impact of that suicide was very, very high, even though the degree of closeness was not as high, that there are still traumatic events that can happen on that. And so that might be something that you've experienced in your own families, or even in your own social networks. So I think about that sometimes with friends, for example. So maybe you lost your very best friend, but the others have only lost, I lost a friend in my friend group, right? That can have very different meanings because of the degree of closeness and the perceived impact of that. Even though we've lost the same person and we might both define them as friends, that friendship had very different meaning to different people. And so I know that again, that's a little confusing to some degree, but it's just sort of meant to measure how people report on this. Both perceived closeness excuse me, and perceived impact can affect mental health outcomes for survivors. So suicide loss survivors are at an increased risk of developing some of their own mental health needs like depression or PTSD. But this is particularly true for those with multiple suicide exposures, who have both a high level of closeness and a high level of impact. So just in terms of a clinical sense, the more loss somebody experiences, the more traumatic loss they experience, the more likely that is to have an impact on their mental health. The greater they perceive the closeness or their own impact to be, the stronger that will have an impact on their mental health also. So just some things that, again, it's not meant to be scary. It's really meant to be a validation for people who maybe are experiencing some of this, who, during their grief and now after their loss are noticing perhaps some mental health symptoms for themselves that they're not familiar with, perhaps some feelings of depression, really having some significant trauma symptoms, that this happens, that, it's not something that we can't work through, but it certainly is a complication that a lot of survivors face. All right. So now we'll kind of go into a few examples, and I think that this will hopefully kind of make what I was saying a little more well-rounded and easier to understand, excuse me. So our first example here, a mother is someone in active addiction, sets loving boundaries with their adult child, letting them know that they will no longer enable their behavior. Their adult child then takes their own life. So that's really speaking on some of those themes we had talked about before around guilt, around blame, around perception of wrongdoing, asking those questions of why didn't I do more? Did my actions push this person away? Did my actions directly lead to them taking their own life? Should I have handled this differently? Right? All of these sort of investigative questions. And again, that self-blame, that guilt, that responsibility that people sometimes take on after a suicide loss. A woman loses her spouse to suicide after being the victim of domestic violence and abuse for the last 20 years. This is certainly something that we've heard about in the loss program. As I mentioned before, not all of our interpersonal relationships are positive. Not all of them give us a sense of belonging. And when we lose someone with whom we've had a lot of conflict, or again, even abuse or neglect, that is a little more complicated in terms of how we work through the big feelings that arise with that. So someone in this situation may be having big feelings of relief, They may be having feelings of feeling unburdened, or of feeling free or lighter in a way that they haven't for a long time, right? And those are really complicated things to work through when we're talking about grief and we're talking about losing someone in a very tragic way. To then have a reaction that perhaps doesn't match the manner of death can feel very strange to people, and can be really hard for people to work through sometimes. And then a young adult loses his fiance to suicide just 2 months before their wedding. So, again, it's one of these things that sometimes, we look at the timeline and we think, wow, yeah, how confusing, right? Someone planning for the future, planning, to be part of a partnership. And so this person may be feeling significant feelings of rejection, confusion, sort of a loss of understanding of their future and what that looks like, and needing to rebuild that. They may have some significant anger and not know, am I allowed to be angry at someone who isn't here? Just a lot of complicated things to work through. And these are not atypical things that people tell us in groups, that people tell us in counseling. Working through that relationship with the person who died can be a really difficult thing to do. So this is, I think, the really important, takeaway of this also, which is maintaining or repairing the relationship with the person we lost. So if some of you came a few months ago to our presentation on the tasks of grief, you may have heard Michelle, one of our clinicians, talking about this, that one of the tasks is maintaining a relationship with the person that we lost. How can we maintain that relationship? And I know it feels a little strange if you haven't heard that language before, but the way we sometimes summarize it is that death ends a life, not a relationship. So there are potentially things that we still need to work through. There are things that we might consider unfinished business, or conflicts that haven't been resolved, questions that we haven't answered, that this is just a complicated piece of this. Are we able to maintain bonds with the person that we lost to suicide? So again, as we mentioned in one of the examples before, sometimes people lose a person who represented a relationship that was not good and was not positive. And that bereavement process is going to look really different, because they may not want to continue that relationship. That might look really different than someone who, is really looking to find ways to maintain those bonds, and really continue, having a relationship with the person who's no longer here. So I think that this quote, I'll read this in a second, can summarize some of this too. So this is a report from Jack Jordan. He's another researcher, another academic who works with suicide survivors. He was our brunch speaker a few years ago. And what he says about this is, suicide is almost always experienced as a rupturing of the relationship with the deceased. Often it is also experienced as an abandonment or rejection of the survivor by the deceased. And as such, an important focus of grief therapy or healing with suicide survivors must be an exploration of the considerable unfinished business suicide can leave behind. So there's a process in there where we're, working to repair those feelings of feeling abandoned or feeling rejected by the person who's no longer here. And so what are some ways that we can explore this task of maintaining or repairing these relationships? And again, that's going to look very different for different people. I'm certainly a big proponent of finding outlets to talk about this. So maybe that looks like, finding a counselor so that I can work through some negative emotions around regrets, or feelings of blame, things that I'm, really holding on to in a way that is, not allowing a repair of this relationship to happen. It may mean, finding others who have also lost a loved one and speaking some of those things out loud to get some validation and some understanding for that. But it could also mean, developing rituals within your family, finding ways to include, loved ones on special occasions, or finding ways to honor their memories. That there are a lot of different ways that we can continue that relationship. It's just going to look a little different for each person. All right. How are we doing? Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to pause and look at the chat for a second because, okay, I hope I did close the poll. I see that now. I hope I did. Okay, it's gone. Okay, good. We're just going to take a pause here. If anyone has any questions or comments about the things that we have gone over before, feel free to put them in the chat. And if not, I will keep talking about relationships. But I'm glad the poll isn't blocking, so that's good. Okay, I managed to figure that out.
There were some comments in the chat. The first one I saw was asking for an example of what thwarted belongingness looked like.
Yeah. So the thwarted belongingness stuff, I would sort of refer you back to the interpersonal needs questionnaire, because that's really what that's getting at. Do I feel that I am in meaningful relationships with other people? Am I feeling that, I have relationships that have meaning, that are non-judgmental, that are accepting of me, where I can be myself? Or am I feeling isolated? Am I feeling dejected? Am I feeling bullied? Am I feeling othered? And so really it comes down to a feeling of perception, right? So it's not whether I think someone belongs or not, it's someone's perception of whether I have close and meaningful relationships, and are they giving me that sense of belonging that I'm looking for. So that's sort of what that's meant to gauge, is that sort of the quality, right? The meaningfulness of those relationships, if that makes sense. Is there another one in there, Debbie?
So there was a comment that somebody expressed some anxiety about when it comes to thinking about increased risk for their children after losing their father to suicide.
Yes.
I think that came up when you were asking people to talk about the meaning of the relationship.
Sure. So, and that's something we're gonna, we're gonna touch a little bit on in this section also, because that sense of hypervigilance, or that sense that, bad things can happen to other people in my life, and what do I do if that happens, is also just very common. And so I don't say that, suicide loss survivors are at, greater risk for struggles with their mental health, again, to scare anyone. And I'm also not saying that that is something that 100% of the time is going to happen, right? That we also, and I'm not talking about this so much tonight, but it is something I think to think about, which is protective factors. And so we're not only looking at, what are some of the things that we need to worry about, right? Like, what are some of the things that are stacking up for people that might make them more susceptible, to taking their lives. We're also thinking about what are the protective factors that people have that help protect against that, right? And so they're related, because we also know that a sense of belonging and having meaningful, substantial relationships is also a huge protective factor for people. So feeling like you have folks that you can rely on, people that you can have honest conversation with, is a protective factor for people, to really manage their mental health in a positive way. And so again, we'll talk a little bit about that hypervigilance piece, but it's really more, something that we want to be aware of, but not operating from a place of fear either. So we'll I think talk about that a little bit more as we go on. So this section here, and I've got a lot of examples in this section because I think this is where I think this is really where a lot of people spend a lot of their time. Although, kind of looking at our relationship with the person we lost, I think it's a really big task of our grief. The here and now and how we're trying to navigate our current relationships, I think is often what is taking up a lot of brain space for people. It takes up a lot of energy and a lot of worry. So these are some of the things that we'll talk about. So we'll go over some themes that are commonly reported by suicide loss survivors. I've got sort of a list of them, and some of them may relate to your own stories. We'll talk about conflict and differences in styles of grieving and coping. So what I want to say about that is that we are going to talk a lot about conflict. And we're talking about it because it's common. But as I was thinking through earlier about this, it's common, but it's not hopeless, right? So we're not talking about conflict as something that is insurmountable or something that we, can't resolve. I don't think that that's accurate. I think that for the most part, these things can improve over time if we give ourselves some grace and some patience. And so, yes, we'll be talking about some conflict, but also just know that it doesn't mean that that's hopeless, that our relationships are, just going to totally explode and there's no hope for them. That definitely is not true. The other thing I think when we talk about conflict, excuse me, and differences in styles of coping is try to remember, and I know that this one is really difficult, and I really do understand that most people are not trying to cause you harm. They really just don't know how to support you. And I am not saying that as an excuse. I have found myself being angry at others many times for not seeming to give, the effort I think they should to understand my point of view or my experience. But I've certainly come to find that most people are not trying to hurt us. They're certainly not trying to make our grief worse. And that those things tend to happen unintentionally. And so I think that that's just an important thing to keep in mind, because we can feel already just, so isolated and so on our own, that, people are more likely to be thoughtless, or to say something that, is just sort of, just I think thoughtless is the best way I can put that, than they are of trying to say something that's intentionally hurtful for us. Or one of the things that we talk about a lot is that we have a perception that our friends want us to be thinking or feeling or acting a certain way, which maybe they haven't communicated to us, but it's something that we're picking up on. This idea that maybe we should have moved on already. Do we have people who report that people around them have said negative and insulting things? Yes, it does happen. Unfortunately, it does happen. But I would say that most of the time that hurt is coming from things that are thoughtless and unintentional, not because people are trying to make us feel worse. Which is something I had to remind myself of a few times. So anyway, just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that. Okay, so I think that this is a quote that really sums up a lot of this. And again, this is from Jack Jordan, a researcher, and one of our former brunch speakers. So he says, many survivors find that a portion of their relationships are altered or even permanently lost after the death of their loved one. Many also report avoidance behaviors from their friends and family members. Moreover, survivors may self-stigmatize and withdraw from previously close connections out of a sense of shame and estrangement. The result can be awkwardness and avoidance on the part of the social network around the survivor, which can make suicide a very isolating experience. The repair and rebuilding of connections with family members and peers, as well as the forging of new connections, can be a major challenge for survivors. So again, this is really just meant to show that this is a common thing that suicide loss survivors support, that these are common experiences, that people, either experience a lack of support, a lack of understanding, avoidance behaviors, either on their own part or on the part of those around them, and then this idea of isolation. And so, a common experience, yes, but also something that we can work through, we can talk about, and find some good support for. So going off of that a little bit, so these are some of the things that I have heard in groups, or I've heard in therapy, I've experienced myself. But I want to just start with the statement at the top that most individuals report some level of change in their interpersonal relationships after suicide loss. When I was doing the research, one of the reports I saw said 86% of their respondents said that this was true for them, that they had some level of change in their interpersonal relationships. It doesn't mean that they all lost relationships. It doesn't mean that, they all had significant, negative outcomes, but that people recognize a change in how they're interacting with other people and how other people are interacting with them. So these are just some of the things we've heard. And again, you may have experienced some of these. You may not have. They may resonate, they may not. But conflict with others who are experiencing their grief differently. So this is something that we certainly hear within families. It's something that I talk about in my own family. My mom and I have talked about this. She and I have developed, I think, a real comfort in talking about our loss. She and I talk about that pretty freely with one another, and how we feel about it, how we're processing it. My dad and my sister have struggled a bit more with that. They're not always as forthcoming with their feelings, or the memories that they're having. And so even within my own family, that's something that we've experienced. It's not uncommon for us to hear that from parents who have lost children. When they're grieving differently, that can feel really bad. But again, not an uncommon thing. It's just we're very different people, and we respond to loss and grief very differently. And we'll go again into a couple of examples of that. Social discomfort, discussing the manner of death. So this is something that comes up very, very often, of just kind of, how do I even talk about this? Say maybe you've lost a young person, and so people maybe automatically are thinking, well, what happened? I didn't lose, a 90-year-old grandparent. I lost a 28-year-old brother. And so people have questions about that, and it's it can be really uncomfortable to try to think of what to say, or to how to navigate those conversations. Social awkwardness and withdrawal. A lot of people just sort of talk about how social situations are really exhausting, and so they withdraw with them altogether, or just an awkwardness that happens. I'm not sure that people, even really want me there. Are they looking at me like, oh my gosh, like there's the sad grieving person, right? Like this perceived awkwardness of handling those interactions. Loss of confidence in social situations, which is, similar. Maybe someone was, really good at making small talk at the holiday, party for their workplace. And now all of a sudden that has just really gone out the window, right? This loss of confidence and sort of putting yourself out there, even engaging in conversation or interactions with other people can be really difficult. And then fear of further losses. So that's where we're talking a lot about that hypervigilance piece, right? So it's really not uncommon for people who have lost someone in a traumatic way to then fear that now I'm going to lose someone else in a traumatic way, to think that this is, something that can happen to anyone at any time. And so I think, again, as I mentioned, if we could think through, what are some of the protective factors that person has? They have good relationships. They are good at, talking about things that are difficult for them. They, they have activities that they do, or, they move their body and make sure that they're, having some physical movement. We can try to concentrate on those protective factors instead of those risk factors, if that makes sense. But that hypervigilance is definitely a big thing. Jokes or insensitive or thoughtless comments. So this is something that we hear a lot in group, and it's one of those things that can have a big impact, even though the person who sort of tells the joke or makes the comment might be completely unaware that anything even happened. So this is what we're talking about. Like maybe there's a coworker who says something like, well, if that happened to me, I'd just kill myself, right? And just like offhandedly says something like that. Or somebody maybe makes a gesture that's meant to be joking. And for, one of us, we find that very offensive and really out of line. And so these are, again, things that are not things that I don't think are funny and I don't think are appropriate, but they are things that we see sometimes. And again, I don't think are meant to be, intentionally hurtful. I think that they're thoughtless, but that doesn't make them hurt less, if that makes sense. Feeling drawn to others who've experienced loss. So this is something that, again, anecdotally and in the research, people tend to feel drawn to others who get it. So maybe they haven't experienced the same level of loss or the same, relationship or whatever that looks like. But we're feeling drawn to others who seem to be able to understand our experience best. Interestingly, that point actually goes both ways. And I think it kind of connects to that first bullet point about conflict with others. Because we can also feel sort of repelled by people who have experienced the same loss because they're grieving differently, because their perspective of that is differently, that there can be a push and pull with that. Sometimes we feel very drawn to people and sometimes we feel very repelled by them, which I think is just an interesting kind of paradox there. Trouble feeling happiness for others. Again, something that I think is totally understandable. And I get where that comes from. People are getting married or having a new baby. Maybe they got their dream job or they graduated from med school, whatever that looked like. And it's just really hard to be happy for them. And that can go into this feeling of, oh, great, I'm not a good friend, or I'm not a good sibling, I'm not a good, whatever, because I can't even be happy for this person that I care about and this good thing that's happening to them, right? It's just a capacity issue, I think, that a lot of people deal with. And then this last point, I think, is also just really important. People who step up and people who step away. And I think most of our clinicians would probably agree that this is something that we hear about a lot. That sometimes the person we thought was going to be our partner through grief, they were going to be the person who was there for us. They were going to really see us through. It turns out they really couldn't handle it in the way that we needed them to. They couldn't step up and support us in the way that we needed them to. And the person who does do that and who does take on that role might be someone that we never thought. And so it can really kind of change our interpersonal relationships in that regard also. Okay. All right. So I'm going to get into a couple more vignettes here. And then I think that, again, something in here will likely resonate with folks as my hope. So we're going to go through a few different examples and kind of highlight some of the things we hear. And again, these are all examples that are based in real life, but are not factual, if that makes sense. So these are all themes of things that we've heard, but I've tried to, sort of blend them together so they're not talking specifically about any one person's experience. So, I'm not, for confidentiality reasons and all of that, I'm not, using anyone's particular story, but just, to highlight some themes, of things we hear. So our first example, two brothers lose their aging father to suicide and request to go to separate support groups because they have been arguing. The brother who lived closest to the father has anger toward the other for being far away and not providing enough support. The brother who lived further believes that his brother should have seen the signs and provided better care. So this again goes into this concept of perceived blame. Losing someone to suicide feels really bad. And so sometimes we're looking for places to put that blame. And sometimes it's the people who are closest to us. I think in an example like this, it's likely that both of them are feeling some level of responsibility, having a difficult time sort of processing that and then sort of aiming it at one another. But that perceived blame can can be a real source of conflict in a lot of families. A woman loses her husband to suicide. She begins receiving questions and criticisms from her husband's family, who seemingly blame her for the loss, as they were experiencing some marital issues at the time of his death. So in each of sort of the relationship losses, I think that there are some unique factors. And I think that this is a big one for spousal and partner loss. The relationship with in-laws can sometimes be very difficult, where, we would hope perhaps that, their family, being the ones who loved and knew them best, would maybe come together to offer support. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and there's blame, there's isolation. And in a case like this, there could be a loss of other relationships, right? So if the in-law families are having blame, this person, after losing her husband, could also end up losing several other relationships because of that perceived blame, or just not understanding, all of the different factors, again, that go into why someone takes their life. A young adult loses their sibling and has difficulty navigating relationships within their peer group. Their friends have only experienced the loss of a grandparent and appear scared to talk about suicide loss. This young person believes that their grief makes others uncomfortable, and they stop making plans with friends. We do hear some specific themes, especially in our young adult group, with those who are young adults who have lost loved ones. And this idea that my peers do not understand, that I do not know how to talk about this with people who have never experienced great loss before, is very common. And sort of wanting to find others in that same age group who get it. That was true for me. I was 26 when my brother died. And that was certainly my experience. I didn't know anyone else who had lost a sibling, someone else in their 20s. And so that social isolation was very real, and that perceived sense of discomfort, that I'm somehow making others feel badly because I'm sad or because I'm grieving, was definitely a piece of that for me too. A couple more examples here. A couple loses their young adult daughter to suicide. The mother has great need to talk about the loss and how much their daughter is missed. The father finds speaking about his daughter to be very painful and will not engage in conversations around the loss. So again, this is another thing we see sometimes in terms of conflict. I think in most of these situations, it has nothing to do with, these two individuals. They want to support each other. They want to show up for each other, but they're just processing things and handling things very differently. And I think it's another example that sometimes the closest degree of relationship to us is not always the person who's going to be the person who helps us through our grief the most. So it might be somebody outside of that partnership. But again, it doesn't mean that these things can't come together over time. It doesn't mean that, two people sort of following their own paths through their grief journey and finding understanding of things, that they can't come back together on a similar journey at some point. And I think we see a lot of that too, thankfully. A woman loses her nephew to suicide and becomes fearful that her own children may be struggling. She reaches out to them multiple times each day to check in and make sure that everything is okay. So this is really when we're getting to that concept of hypervigilance and what that might look like sometimes, that sometimes it can come into play as being sort of overbearing, or being, needy, or, those sorts of things. But really what it's stemming from is this place of anxiety and of fear, that I just, cannot have another person close to me be in pain or be suffering and not know about that. And so I'm going to check in to gain as much sense of control as I can. And so again, that hypervigilance is very, very common. And I always, again, encourage people to look for protective factors. What are the things that they have going for them that are good protective factors, and work in a positive way with our mental health. And then a man loses his best friend. He begins experiencing significant social anxiety and finds interactions with others very difficult, both in public and at work. He recently missed his cousin's wedding because he did not feel he could navigate conversations with others. So again, this sort of highlights these concepts, excuse me, that we have of social awkwardness, of anxiety, how difficult it can be to interact with others in a casual way, of just trying to, sort of make small talk. And I think also highlights that, even being in a place with people who are comfortable or familiar to you doesn't mean that you're not going to have anxiety. It doesn't mean that you're not going to perhaps feel, socially awkward or have trouble, engaging in conversations or interactions. And so even with people that we know or that, family members and that sort of thing, that we might still experience that, and we still might try to avoid those situations. So those are just some examples, some vignettes, and different things that I hope maybe resonated to some degree to sort of look at some of these concepts, some of these themes, and really common experiences that people have. And I'm sure that there are a million more vignettes I could have written, because we certainly know a lot of these. Hear a lot about these. Okay, so then we're just going to spend a little time on this, not a whole lot of time, but interpersonal relationships can help us in our grief. And so even though, yes, I've been talking a bit about conflict and how, that can be unfortunate, but also common, our interpersonal relationships can also be very, very helpful. And that's also what the literature tells us. So I mentioned just here about attachment styles. So it's not a theory that I use a whole lot. Some clinicians, really look at attachment styles as a way to sort of work with, clients through different things. And so you may have heard of this concept before in terms of secure attachment, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, fearful attachment. But the one thing that it does tell us is that that folks who have the classic secure attachment, right, which also usually indicates this more of a comfort in relying on other people, that gives us positive outcomes for grieving people. So what I mean is that people who have more of a comfort in the second bullet point, disclosure and talking about their loss, that's a good thing in terms of our own positive outcomes during grief. And so if we can find safe people and safe outlets for us to talk about that, where we can talk about our loss out loud, where we can disclose that in a way where it's, accepted and it's not non-judgmental, and we can receive some empathy, that can absolutely have some positive outcomes for us and moving forward in our grief. And then also just to, we are who we are, right? In some ways, which also is what leads to these conflicts and our styles of grief. But if you're someone who struggles to depend on others in your day-to-day life, it makes sense that you would struggle to depend on others in your grief too. If you're someone who, really readily speaks about the things that, are difficult for you, that you're comfortable and sort of outwardly processing your emotions and discussing those with other people, it's more likely you will be after significant loss too. So there's a piece of that just has to do with our comfort level, and how we trust in other people, and sort of what that looks like for us. And so we can practice relying on others to help meet our needs and rebuild trust. We can really try to, seek out those people who represent very safe and secure relationships for us as a way to practice that. And another plug that I'll put in here for support groups also, I think that's a really good outlet for practicing some of that, to be able to tell your story and to have, people in a support group, nod along or offer you some support, or offer you a kind word, of validation, I think can really go a long way in helping to rebuild that trust that was potentially lost by these feelings of abandonment when our loved one died. And then this last point, I also think is just so important. Spend time with the people who are most helpful. So, there may be relationships during your grief that you're finding this is just causing a lot of stress for me, or I'm using, more energy than I have to maintain this relationship. I feel like I'm doing too much work, or someone's not showing up for me in the way that I really need them to. It's okay to not spend your time and effort in repairing that relationship, and to at least right now, right? And to concentrate on the relationships that are giving you something back, that are, sort of feeding you in some way. And I think that can be a really helpful thing to remember. All right. Okay, so then this is just the kind of the last part of what we'll talk about. And then if anyone has any questions or comments, of course, we'll have a few minutes for discussion about that too. But, just wanted to touch on, how does grief from suicide loss impact our ability to form new relationships? Because it can. And I think that this is something that can be tricky for folks, and something that definitely, again, comes up in our groups. So some of those same social related themes that we've been talking about, so a lack of social confidence or feeling socially awkward, of course, that's going to mean making friends and making, new relationships are going to be difficult. If I don't feel that I have the social skills to do that, if I feel that my capacity and energy for engaging in those conversations is very low, that's going to be really hard. So, just kind of keeping in mind that that's something that, it can be difficult to do when we're experiencing all of those other things. This piece about differences across the lifespan is really meant to sort of highlight how this could be different developmentally, right? So for an adolescent, for example, who loses a friend, or a young adult, who loses someone in their life, that new relationship formation has a different function than perhaps it does later in life. So when we're still in that developmental stage of, creating lasting bonds with peers, relying on our peers more to meet our social needs, then that might look a little different even after loss, right? Versus somebody who maybe, is an older adult and doesn't spend a lot of time worrying about crafting new relationships. They're very, comfortable with the relationships that they have. They find meaning in those, and, a sense of belongingness from those, that this idea of relationship formation may not be really what they're looking for, and that's okay. Older adults, or, older folks might also just have more connections with people who understand loss and who understand grief. And so they may, even if it's not to suicide, they may just have people in their circle who understand some of these feelings a little bit better, or a little more readily, I guess I should say. And then again, sort of using so trusting others with information about our loss is something that takes some practice. And so when we're talking about building new relationships, just understanding it may take some time to disclose that. There may need to be a level of trust and a level of connection that's built before we even feel comfortable and engaging in that discussion. And that, sometimes, again, it just takes time. And then again, I just have to emphasize the power of connecting with other survivors. I just don't think that I can talk about that enough, and how that can really give us good practice for talking to others. I think our groups are a very safe place, again, to practice some of these things, to maybe regain some trust, to see what it feels like to sort of tell our story, and have others react to that. And so that can just be a really helpful thing when we're thinking about engaging in relationships with new people. So here are just some things to keep in mind, again, about forming new relationships. It may take time to even have any desire to form relationships. So it might just be something that I don't have the brain energy, the physical energy, the emotional energy to do such a thing. I don't feel like I can be a good friend right now, so I'm not going to develop a new relationship. All of that is okay, and all of that takes time. So I'm certainly not thinking that anyone, 2 months after their loss is ready to jump back into building a new and meaningful relationship. I think that is something that likely takes time. And so just know that if you're not having the desire, that's okay. That I think there's a big difference between that and withdrawing socially and having sort of feelings of isolation. Those look a little different. Survivors sometimes report low tolerance for superficial conversations. So this is something we also hear in our groups sometimes, like, why are you talking to me about the weather? Like, that's just not a conversation I need to have. It's using the limited energy that I have. And so, people sometimes prefer to sort of save up that limited energy or capacity for things that are more meaningful, for relationships that are more meaningful. And so if this is you, and it was certainly me, for having low tolerance for sort of superficial conversations or small talk, that sort of thing, just know that is not atypical either, and that is okay. Practicing a narrative of your loss can be really helpful in navigating conversations with new people. So this is something that, we sometimes do in therapy sessions or even in groups. We really encourage people to sort of come up with a narrative of the loss. And it's not meant to be something that, okay, well, this is, meant to encapsulate my whole story. It isn't, and it can't. But it can be a way where you can disclose about your loss or talk about your loss in a way that feels safe, and in a way where you're withholding the information you want to withhold and giving the information you want to give. And so you might have different narratives for different people, for different situations, but having some practice with that and sort of knowing what you might be comfortable with sharing. If that were to come up, that's okay. New relationships may develop with people you did not expect. So that kind of goes back to this idea of people who step up and people who step away, that just doesn't always look the way that we thought that it would. And so just kind of, keeping an open mind to that might be the case. And then one thing I didn't put on the slide, but I'll just mention, because it does come up in a couple different capacities. We sometimes will hear, for those I think who have lost a spouse or have lost a partner, that sometimes they'll receive unkind comments about, oh, well, you'll find another one, right? Or, you'll find another person. The idea is never for us to be looking for a replacement for the person that we lost. That is not at all what the goal of this is. But the goal is for us to have substantial and meaningful relationships. And, that, dating at some point may be a part of that, and it may not be. But that I think that our folks who have lost spouses sometimes receive different comments in that way. And I've said this before in a group too, no one has ever asked me when I'm going to get another brother. And so I just kind of think about that, like, okay, well, maybe we don't need to be extending that conversation to our spousal and partner survivors. But also that's something that comes up a lot with our young adults. So we do have a young adult support group. And sometimes our young adults have a need to talk about, dating or forming new relationships, dating or forming new relationships, and just talking about how difficult that is, in a way that we don't have that represented in all of our groups. And so again, there can be just some differences developmentally with that too. So I'm just going to go over some quick vignettes with this, and then we will go ahead and wrap it up, because I'm running out of time anyway. But a woman loses her brother to suicide. A coworker approaches her to let her know that she also lost her brother to suicide 2 years ago. They attend support groups together and become close and supportive friends. I know that this story is true because it's mine. And this is exactly what happened to me after I lost my brother. I'm so thankful to say that a coworker came up to me, and she brought me into my first loss group, and I will always consider her to be a lifelong friend. She is dear to me, and I am so thankful for her. And so again, that was a relationship I didn't expect, but one I am eternally grateful for, eternally grateful. A man loses his spouse to suicide. The following year, he begins taking CrossFit classes and finds a second home at the gym with people who build him up and encourage him to practice self-care. So an example like this, this isn't something that somebody is going to be able to do right away, but maybe after 12 months when I'm, in a different headspace, or, 18 months or 2 years, whatever that looks like, that we know the timeline is not, doesn't fit that way. But that after some time, maybe I do want to do some things, for me, and maybe that also has a social benefit. And so maybe I'm opening myself back up to social relationships and engaging in that again. And a woman loses her son to suicide. She begins volunteering at a local food pantry, which allows her to have social interactions while honoring the kind and generous spirit of her son. So this again is another example of a way to sort of practice this if we're feeling, I'm socially inept or I'm socially awkward, finding, an outlet where you can have maybe brief, but also meaningful interactions with people to sort of practice that and kind of regain that sense of self. And relationships. So I will just leave you with this quote that I think really sums up a lot of what I hope you got from what I've been saying today, which is, if we can share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame can't survive. And I think that is truly the benefit of finding safe outlets to talk about our loss, whether that's in a group, whether that's with our counselor. When we really and truly feel that someone sees us, someone understands us, that we're not being judged, that we're being accepted. This is something I absolutely believe that our shame can't survive. And a Brene Brown quote, if you all are familiar with Brene Brown, she's a researcher and a social worker. These are just a long list of boring references and journal articles that I'm sure most of you do not want to read. But if you do have any questions about anything we covered, just let me know. You can always send me an email. This is the lost email. So this is how you can get in touch with us here at the program. That's our website, our email, our main phone number. And then if you were to search for loss on the YouTube website, you would find our YouTube channel that also has a lot of different past presentations that we've done. So those are all up on our YouTube channel. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my share now. So again, if there is anybody who needs anything, additionally, let us know, get in touch. And then I'll just go ahead and check at the chat, see if there's anything in there of people who are asking questions. But it looks to me like there are a lot of people who are sharing their stories and their experiences. And it looks like a lot of people, giving them their validation and their support, which I know that our survivors do. So